Hi, I'm Scott Stripling, Director of Excavations for the Associates for Biblical Research, Provost at the Bible Seminary, and President of the Near East Archaeological Society. I'm looking forward to talking to you about the intricate relationship between the Bible and ancient Near Eastern archaeology. Please peruse the websites on the screen to learn more about me and my research.
You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Scott Stripling. He's the director of the Archaeology Institute at the Bible Seminary in Katy, Texas. If you look on YouTube, if you look up Bible Archaeology, all one word put together, that's their channel. We're going to talk about the cursed tablet on Mount Ebal, the building of the Tabernacle at Shiloh, and more biblical archaeology type elements that I'm not very familiar with, but undoubtedly Scott will be. So welcome, Scott.
Hey, thank you. Excited to be with you today.
Well, excellent. Tell me a bit about your background and what got you into this area of study.
Well, that's a great question. I was a biblical studies major and was a pastor, an obsessive reader of the biblical text and the background of the biblical text. I went to seminary, and which was a great experience, but I came away with just as many questions as I had answers. And I kept encountering people saying that archaeology contradicted the biblical text or the challenged historicity of the text. And that sort of became a deep dive to me. I doubted that that was true, and I wanted to explore it for myself. So I began to just consume everything I could get a hold of, books, magazines, back then, videos, and TV programs. Ultimately started taking some courses, volunteering on digs, and kind of set a course, if you will. And the deeper I went, the more that I wanted to know. And, eventually I worked my way, I guess, from the bottom up through the hierarchy, and completed my PhD, and ultimately then began to lead the excavations for ABR.
You worked your way up through the sedimentary layers to where you are today.
Well, that's right. Like a broken pot shirt, I worked my way up.
So I'm skipping to the end, and then we'll just continue. But has all this work strengthened your faith, or has it made you, come away from the faith of Christianity? Like, what's overall, how do you feel today?
Well, I would say it has not moved me from where I was. I was a believer in Jesus Christ. I was a committed Christian, an evangelical Christian. I think what it has done is given me satisfaction and fulfillment, and better equipped me to be able to share truth with others. And, I don't have an axe to grind with anybody, but I just don't want to see a playing field in this arena of ideas that we all engage in culturally. I just don't like the idea of a field slanted against the Bible, where the Bible's guilty until proven innocent. I just like to have a level field where we can dialogue about the relationship between archaeology and biblical text and other texts.
Yeah, I watched, many videos on this. Some of them were 40 years old. They certainly didn't have CGI and things like that to fake things back then. Do you ever hear that? Oh, that's just fake. That's just on YouTube.
And there is fake stuff. There is pseudo-archaeology. There's people who make outrageous claims. They're almost never real archaeologists. These are people they'll call themselves researchers or explorers or something like that. But if you're looking at someone who's credentialed, a licensed credentialed archaeologist, it's very rare. Unfortunately, there have been instances even in that field where that happens. But I mean, for someone to fake something who's an actual archaeologist, you'd be risking your whole career.
So what's an archaeological find maybe early on that just shocked you, but in a good way, or you were like, wow, I can't believe I'm seeing this?
Well, there have been several. I would say finding a cluster of human skeletons that had been crushed by a mud brick wall as a result of an earthquake. It had collapsed and crushed this family. And actually, they were all females. I suppose the men were out working in the fields or something, but a woman and young daughters all females, and they all had bracelets. Even the little girls had bracelets, and it just brought home the idea of the humanity of this. You know, these were real people just like us. They started their day like any other day. These little girls probably had dreams about what their life would look like. They were going to grow up and get married and have their own families and so forth. And then just immediately the ground starts shaking, walls collapse, and bam, it's over. Until 3,000 years later, we uncover them and in some sense are able to tell their story.
Yeah, that's amazing. In the description, you talked about cursed tablet, Mount Ebal and Shiloh. So, for listeners that don't know, what are those things?
Well, our main excavation is at Shiloh, which was Israel's first capital, of course, before Jerusalem, where the tabernacle and Ark of the Covenant were for over 3 centuries. I've been excavating there since 2017, leading the ABR team, which is a consortium of about 16 universities and institutions. And we're uncovering the matrix of the sacrificial system at Shiloh from the tabernacle period. So it's very, very interesting. But on a side project back in 2019, sometimes we do winter projects in addition to our summer digs. We had been using a new technology that had been reintroduced by Gabi Barkaya in the Temple Mount Sifting Project, and I'd worked for 2 years as a supervisor on that project. And I made up my mind that when I had the opportunity, I was going to actually take it into the field to deal with stratified, undisturbed remains so that we could identify many more things than we were able to identify when they're covered with dirt, even if we dry sifted them. So to make a long story short, that led to the project in 2019 where I was taking 2 dump piles from the 1980s, one from Shiloh, from the previous excavation there, and one from Mount Ebal that Adam Zertal had left behind. And it was in that Mount Ebal project where we uncovered the curse tablet.
And what is the cursed tablet? What's the context of it?
So curse tablets have been around for millennia. The idea of how we control the supernatural. These are incantations, spells, curses, so forth. In Egypt, they're called execration texts. In the Bible, we read in Job 19:25, "Oh, that my words were written on a lead tablet with an iron pen." And so this idea that we're going to write something and then it becomes powerful or it becomes binding. Now, many hundreds of these have been found in Israel and many more around the Mediterranean. We call this particular type a defixio, or a curse tablet. So it's a strip of lead that has writing that is then folded and sealed. It hardens and it can't be opened then, or you would break it in the process of opening it. And these are normally found in wells and in tombs, someplace in the earth, where perhaps they're going into the underworld and they're binding. Many times they're very petty sorts of curses. Personal curses, like may the woman who stole my boyfriend, may her hair fall out, or just something, petty like that. But sometimes they're also very serious national types of curses. And that's what we recovered on the Mount Ebal tablet, was something that was of a very serious nature.
Well, who wrote on this tablet supposedly, and what was the reason?
Okay, well, our interpretation after studying this for 18 months, and this was the collaborative team that I put together from scientists from Prague and Czechoslovakia who had the tomographic technology that enabled us to penetrate the lead and see the ancient letters on the inside of the tablet. Peter van der Veen is a renowned epigrapher from Germany, Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, Gershon Galil from the University of Haifa in Israel. And together we studied this for 18 months and published our findings. And so what we found was very shocking. It was a proto-alphabetic script, what is sometimes called Proto-Canaanite or Proto-Sinaitic type script, which is fairly well known in the Sinai and in Canaan in the late Bronze Age. There has been some debate about whether we should call this Proto-Hebrew or Proto-Canaan, Proto-Phoenician, but we've never had uniquely Hebrew words because they use the same alphabet, the early Hebrews and the Canaanites. You would only be able to define it as ethnic or Israelite or Hebrew, if you will, if there were words that were unique to that lexicon, to that vocabulary.
Would it have been like a dialect, or how much of a difference would Hebrew and Canaanite have been if spoken or written?
Well, they're very similar languages, and it's just that the Canaanites, if they were describing God, they would use a different word than the Israelites would use. And so we're looking for nuances like that. And that's what we found, and that's what makes this so important. We have a series of curses, the word arur in Hebrew, and then the name Yahweh, or the 30-letter spelling Yahu, in a script that predates Paleo-Hebrew. So when we talk about biblical Hebrew, we're talking about Paleo-Hebrew. This is the forerunner or the antecedent of biblical Hebrew. And for this reason, it was very fascinating to see the earliest mention ever found of the name of God. And in fact, from a biblical site, Mount Ebal, where the Bible says that the Israelites pronounced curses and that they were writing. God told Joshua ben Nun to write. And so this addresses a lot of issues that have been around for several generations, like were Moses and Joshua actually literate? The Bible says that they were. Jesus, for your Christian listeners, Jesus said that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. So there's this description of literacy, but we have the majority of scholars denying that and following what's called the documentary hypothesis. These texts, like the Pentateuchal texts, or if you want to include Joshua with it, are written much later, 1,000 years or so later in the maybe Persian period or even as late as the Hellenistic period. And they're redacted over a long period of time. So there are no eyewitnesses of these events that the Bible actually claims that happened. What we discovered was a very early literacy, perhaps as early as 1400 BC, which would, in my view, as you may know, I'm a co-author of the book by Zondervan, 5 Views on the Exodus. In my view, the date of the Exodus would be around 1400, and that's how we dated the script to the late Bronze Age 2 period.
So if they, just to make a joke, it's like Canaanite and Hebrew went into a bar, could they talk to each other? Like how different would their spoken or written language be?
Well, that's a good one. Let me give you an analogy. We have Old English. I have a master's degree in English also, so I've studied the English language pretty carefully. We have Old English. The oldest surviving portion we have is something called Caedmon's Hymn. Someone can just YouTube it and listen to that language. They'll only be able to pick out a few words here and there, but that's Old English. And then we have Middle English, which is more like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. We have Modern English. And with the development of languages, thinking kind of anthropologically, we have the same thing with Hebrew. We have Modern Hebrew, we have Biblical Hebrew, and then we have the ancestor of that, the Proto-Alphabetic Hebrew, where the Egyptian hieroglyphs are just beginning to morph into phonetic letters. And that's what's so important, is that with 22 letters, if you attach sounds to them, now you can write in a very truncated space what would have taken you a library to write if you were using Middle Egyptian. Like, I'm sure Moses knew Middle Egyptian, but, with 600, 700 characters in Middle Egyptian, that would have taken a library to write down the Pentateuch rather than the 5 books that we know today.
Okay. So do you think they would be able to converse with each other, or if your example holds, which I'm sure it does, I wouldn't be able to speak to someone. Maybe in Middle English, Old English, probably no way. I couldn't.
You might know, and you would pick out a few words here and there. You might know that he's talking about your mother, but is he complimenting her cooking or is he insulting her? So, you pick up mater, the word mother was mater and things like that. But as far as what you're actually saying, the specifics, it would be very different.
Okay, so Canaanite and Hebrew, would they have been the distance of Old English to Modern English, or how far apart would they be?
No, I would say the Canaanites and Hebrews were able to communicate with each other. They're using the same script. They live in close proximity to each other. It's just that they have a different pantheon of gods.
Okay, well, that's good. It would be one way if they couldn't communicate and one way if they could, so that's why I asked.
Yeah, great question.
What do you think we would have seen as the interaction between them if they could not really understand each other at all versus the fact that they could, and there was just a few important differences?
Oh, wow. Just think about the colonization here in the Americas, where you have Europeans settling and dealing with Native American tribes that they cannot communicate. Even when there were good intentions among the settlers and maybe among the native tribes, the potential for miscommunication to lead to conflict was immense. And so I think you had the same thing in the ancient world.
What about spiritually in their worship practices? Were they similar, you think, or does anyone know?
Well, before Abraham, you have polytheism all throughout the ancient Near East. But beginning with Abraham, we have the introduction of monotheism. He was a moon worshiper from Ur, and worshipped an entire pantheon of gods. But once he becomes a monotheist and his descendants, which become the Hebrew people, they are monotheist, at least when they're not backsliding. They're monotheists. So they are worshiping God and understanding God in a very different way. A monotheistic view is one sovereign God rules over all, and a polytheistic view is you have dozens, maybe hundreds of deities that rule over different regions or different aspects of the sky, the earth, the rivers, and so forth. So you have to sacrifice to many different places in many different ways, sometimes in very horrific things, even involving, human sacrifice and so forth. So no, their understanding of how you communicated with God between the Hebrews and those around them was pretty different.
So the Mount Ebal tablet, is it written on what was supposed to be on there? And, is there legible writing on there? And have they been compared? It's like, how significant was this find?
Well, I think it was very significant, and people can see the technical research in Heritage Science article. Go to myacademia.edu page if they'd like. They can download it for free from there. It's, again, the very technical publication because it is a very technical scientific process of tomography that we were using. We weren't seeing these letters with the naked eye. We were seeing them through scans. And then the parallels that we found in other inscriptions and other ancient languages. I have a more popular level copy in Bible in Spade that I published in the spring of 2023 that's also on my academia page that folks might find out a little bit more readable. The reason it's important is because it has the name of God, Yahweh or Yahoo, that in the oldest times they were spelling the divine name, the Hebrews were normally with 3 consonants, Yod, Vav. And then we have the word arur, which means curse. Now, we suggest in our research what it could mean, that it could be a chiasm, a type of parallel or inverted poem, a curse that I believe the Bible talks about in Deuteronomy 27 and 28, where the Israelites are binding themselves with the blessings from Mount Gerizim and the curses from Mount Ebal. And so perhaps this tablet is summarizing the curses that we read about at the end of Deuteronomy. If we violate God's covenant, may these things come upon us. So in this sense, it's self-imprecatory. It's not a curse on my enemies. I'm saying, may I be cursed if I don't keep God's law. That's how we interpreted it.
Oh, so it was a physical, I don't know what you call it, affirmation that they were to follow God's law. And if
Absolutely.
they didn't, they were saying we accept that we will be cursed.
Which is exactly what you read at the end of Deuteronomy. That's what they're doing. They're binding themselves with blessings and curses. And so interesting that on Mount Ebal, where Joshua chapter 8 says that Joshua built an altar to the Lord on Mount Ebal, which is what Adam Zertal found in the 1980s, and what we went back and re-examined the dump pile that he had left behind. And in that dump pile, using wet sifting, which is this phenomenal new technology that I think is going to revolutionize archaeology, we went through and were able to find things that Zertal had missed, one of them being this tablet. And the funny thing was, as soon as we saw it, me and 2 other members of my team, Frankie Snyder and Abigail Levitt, we all knew what it was. This is a known quantity. What the surprise was the age of the language on it, because I really knew these from the later Hellenistic and Roman period. So I was very surprised when I found this proto-alphabetic script.
So I may be mistaken, but earlier, I think you said you would date the tablets to about 1400 BC.
That's right. We said about in the late Bronze Age too. So from somewhere between 1200 and 1400, Peter van der Veen and I both felt closer to 1400. Gershon Galileo thought closer to 1200.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I'm sure you've been to these sites and then you sat down at the site or stood at the site and read from the Bible that particular passage that references it. I would guess you've done that. What is that like, if so?
Sure, I have. I'm a Bible reader, and I kind of can't help myself when I'm thinking. I'm at a site. Of course, the biblical text is in my mind if it's a biblical site. And of course, if there's other literature, Egyptian or Ugaritic or whatever, I'm trying to think about that too. Anything that might be relevant to this site that we're going to excavate. But at a site like Mount Ebal, we only know it from the biblical text. And to have found an altar there that dated to the time of Joshua ben Nun, and then to find an artifact like this was fantastic. I know when I was sitting there at the altar praying, just thinking and beginning this project, I did have a sense, a providential sense that there was something important that we were going to uncover from this investigation.
I would think maybe some of the juiciest discard piles would be from the 1930s or 20s or even 1880s. When you go to a site, can you tell what a discard pile looks like? Does it have any particular structure to it?
Very easy to tell if you know what you're looking for. So you'll be able to see the area that was excavated because it'll still be visible and obvious that it was excavated. And it'll be very close to the dump pile because people are only going to carry the refuse as little distance as possible. And so the dump piles are very close and there are huge piles that are in. You can sort through those and you are exactly right. If with time, if we were to go through these dump piles from the 19th century, early 20th century, we found more in dump piles in some instances than the archaeologists published in their reports. And I mean scarabs and bulas and seals and impressions, important things that they just thought, and I know why. In the past, we have all been throwing away the majority of the small finds. But when we wash this matrix that is normally, it's been examined and then it's discarded, when we wash it, wow, what we thought was a little rock is actually a scarab from Pharaoh Thutmose III, for example. So I think this is a game changer, and we are doing our best. That was the whole motivation of my project. I wasn't looking for curse tablets. I was doing a methodological process to publish a boring academic paper to say to my colleagues, methodologically, there is a better way to do this. And so I was very surprised that we actually uncovered this curse tablet.
An existing site and not a discard pile. I mean, these sites get rained on sometimes. Would you be able to use any wet sifting method or any wet method to expose more details that otherwise wouldn't be seen on a stele or some other feature, a wall?
Okay, well, when it rains, which is rare, but when it rains, colors do pop. And so that is a good time to visit an archaeological site because you will see colors pop that normally are just faded out, by the sun over thousands of years. But as far as rain helping you wet sift in some way, no, the rain just makes a mess. It makes everything gooey. What we have is we built our own water tower so that we have pressure. And then we have 8 stations with power hoses where we're able to wash all the mud, all the dirt off, and then see what's left. Whereas, just rain on a site would kind of make a mess.
Is there a catalog of, there's a catalog of excavations, but what about refuse piles? Like, do you have a library of ones that you want to go see?
Well, you know what? I wish I had a whole other lifetime and, we could do so many more things, but this is new and I've got my hands full with the Shiloh excavation and then maybe one other project after that. And we're just so busy publishing our research and all. I think that's going to fall to another generation. Sadly, that in past dig reports, I have never seen a dig report. I'll take that back. It's very rare in a dig report, whether it's a final report or a provisional report, that an archaeologist will mark where their dump piles are. It just doesn't cross their mind. And plus, it's self-evident. You can see them easily. So to answer your question, no, there is no catalog. Someone would need, and that would probably be a good PhD project for someone to do, to identify these dump piles at all these sites and catalog them in some way.
Is there anything special that happens to a discard pile that's been around for 30 years, 50 years, 100 years?
No.
Do they tend to get rifled through or what happens?
No, people forget about them and they just lay there. Maybe looters come along with metal detectors and, on the surface, maybe they dig some coins out of there, but that's about it. The value of the wet sifting is when you do it in the field in situ so that we know where that material is coming from. So I'm trying to get people to wet sift before they even create dump piles. So like my excavation at Shiloh, there will not be dump piles. There's nothing left when we finish. So there's gravel and then we pave the roads with the local roads with the gravel when we're done because there is nothing left. So that's my hope is in the future, we won't keep making dump piles because the material should be processed properly while we're in the field so that we understand its stratigraphy. The value of an inscription is what I know the level that it came from.
When you're wet sifting a dump pile, you're categorizing it as you go, but you're taking off the top and slowly, digging down to the pile to the freshest parts. So you're cataloging that and reversing the order of what you find, or you're putting any context.
Exactly. And for us, that's the most important thing. Every locus we excavate must be assigned to a stratum, and each stratum must be in a sequence. So ultimately, that's the whole game. That's what we want to do with excellence. is to be able to recreate what we are excavating. And I wish it was as simple as a layer cake, but there's all kinds of dips and, later peoples mess up your stratigraphy. And so it's quite complex, but that's our goal in the end.
There's multiple piles. Can you tell when one was, I would imagine people digging and throwing stuff. When the pile gets high enough, they're like, all right, we can't put any more there. And they start another one. Can you tell when that happened?
That normally doesn't happen. Like, for example, go to Megiddo and you'll see massive dump piles there, that date back to 100 years. And they keep pushing it out a little bit more and extending it. But as far as creating another dump pile for the same excavation area, that normally doesn't happen. But you may have several dump piles going during an excavation. Let's say you're excavating in areas A, B, C, and D. Each one of those areas would have its own dump pile because you want to only carry the material a short distance before you discard it.
Okay. Well, if you don't mind, let's talk a little bit about Shiloh. From what I've seen, just very briefly online a while ago, it's a massive place to dig. Is that right? Like, what's the dimensions of it?
Shiloh, that's an amazing place. That's my favorite place. Shiloh inside the walled area is about 5.5, 6 acres. Outside the walled area, of course, you had people living as well. So it's not that it's a massive site. Jericho is about 9 acres inside the walled area. Shechem a little bit more than that. So it's not that it's a massive site. It's important because it was Israel's first capital. And that's where the tabernacle was for over 3 centuries. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was. So when we went to Shiloh to excavate, on my radar was the fact that we were going to carefully excavate from the top down, beginning with Islamic ruins and Byzantine and then late Roman and early Roman and then getting into sort of Persian period and all the way back through the Iron Age and into the Bronze Age. My interest was in the tabernacle period, which for us would be Iron Age 1 and late Bronze Age 2, or Stratum 5, Stratum 6 for us. To get there, we had to be very careful, train our team on protocols. And when we got into that matrix, it was quite amazing because we uncovered a building, began to uncover a building, we're still working on it, that appeared to match the dimensions of the tabernacle as given to us in the Bible. And it was east-west, and it dated to that time period. And so we were highly motivated, super interested to keep excavating that building, as well as the nearby gate complex that's mentioned in the Bible, and then a Fabisa, or talking about garbage here, this is sacred garbage, a Fabisa, due east of this monumental building, a Fabisa, which is like tens of thousands of animal bones and related sacrifices and offerings, evidence of a sacrificial system at Shiloh.
I was going to ask you, right, so the tabernacle, this may be where it was, in the specific spot where the Ark of the Covenant would have sat in the Holy of Holies. Are you anywhere close to finding that, or has it been found?
If I'm right, and this building that matches the dimensions of the tabernacle, and it's divided into 2-to-1 ratios between holy and most holy space, if my hypothesis proves to be true, we've got to finish excavating the building, then yes, we have identified it, including the Holy of Holies, and the walls are very well preserved, in some places up to 3 meters in height. Now, you might be wondering, what do you mean by building? I thought the tabernacle was a tent. So let me give you a couple things to think about on that. In the biblical text of 1 Samuel 3, we see a change. In the Hebrew, it's very clear, but you'll pick it up in English too, where you begin to read about the walls of the tabernacle and the door of the tabernacle. It's even called a temple. Samuel went into the temple of the Lord rather than the tabernacle. So commentators, if you go back and look at old commentaries, they knew this. They picked up on this and wondered, was there a permanent building built there based on that language? So I was already aware of that. And I knew that in the Talmud, what's called the Zebayim and the Seder Olam, you have 2 places where it says that a permanent building was built at Shiloh with a tent over it as a roof. So it's a quasi-tabernacle tent. It has stone walls, but a tent as a roof. Here we come along as archaeologists all these decades and millennia later, and what do we find but a building that matches those dimensions, that is east-west and has a large amount of cultic material associated with it.
Was that how the tabernacle was prescribed to be built? Is permanent structure with tent ceiling, or was it modified at all?
We don't know how they got permission from God to build a permanent building. it's a tent in the wilderness. And when Joshua 18:1, when they erect the tabernacle at Shiloh, it's still a tent. But a couple of hundred years later, we start reading language in 1 Samuel that indicates that it's a permanent structure. And even the word temple is used instead of mishkan or tabernacle. Like the word delet in Hebrew, meaning door, it's not a curtain, it's a door. So you're getting the permanency of language in the biblical text. How they determined that God wanted them to do, that's a mystery.
Do you think it was first made as a tent, and then the impracticality of it, they said, you know what, we'll preserve all the things that appear to be ordained, but some of these other things, since there's not really much said about them, we'll just make permanent structures?
Well, I think that's probably true. It was probably pragmatic, and I guess they prayed about it, or they used the Urim and the Thummim, some way to determine God's will to get an answer from God, because the animal skins that made up the Mishkan, they had to be replaced all the time. There's a replica tabernacle at Timnah down in the Negev, and they tell me that every few months they have to replace all the curtains on it because of the wind whipping it. Well, it's even windier up in the Central Hill Country where Shiloh is. And so that would have been a full-time job just maintaining this tent structure. So at some point, perhaps pragmatically, they determined that God would not have a problem with them building a permanent structure.
Would things have blown their way past some of the tent material and into the structure, maybe knock things over, or sand would have gotten up there and piled up? Or, what do you think would have happened? So they built this, and then they probably discovered, my guess is, oh man, we got to do this, that, and the other to maintain it. But what are some of the things that you think that would have bedeviled them early on that made them think we got to find a better solution? Well,
I think the main thing is the curtains of the tabernacle would wear out every few months. And so getting those skins, it's a large structure. And so acquiring those skins and constantly replacing them and maintaining them. And when you do get windy days, believe me, I know, because we put tents up, sunscreens and tents up every day. Each afternoon, the wind picks up and it'll pull our pegs loose and it'll rip our tents. And I just think over time that became an obstacle that they thought God did not want them to have to deal with.
Forgive my ignorance, but it was literally specified that animal skins were to be used for the walls.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the specific types of animal skins. And so the building of the tabernacle, we know quite a bit about from the book of Exodus, from chapters 31 to 38 approximately. But we know the names of the people who built it. Bezalel and Aholiab were the builders, and God gives very specific instructions. So there's quite a bit that we know, assuming that they did build it according to pattern, and God repeatedly told them to build it according to pattern.
When you're inside the structure, when the permanent walls went up, were the permanent walls put where the tents would be, and then on the inside of the walls were tents put up so that when you're inside the structure, it still felt and looked like the walls were of animal skin? Or do you think they just used stone walls now for the wall tabernacle if you're in it?
Well, we can't know for sure, but the two Mishnaic sources, the Zevaim and the Seder Olam, say nothing about tents inside the walls, but they do say there was a tent over the top as a roof.
Yeah, to preserve it being tent-like and exactly how God prescribed it. I would figure you could put walls, and then on the inside you put all, this animal skin material. Now it's protected, but now it can work, closely resemble what they wanted.
Yeah, it may have. I'm just saying we don't have any evidence of that. That would be a hypothesis. Interestingly, we don't have any houses from the early tabernacle period either. We know they were living there because of the pottery and everything else. But once this monumental building is built, then we begin to see domestic structures. And so it's almost like in their mind, how can we build ourselves houses when God himself is living in a tent? Because David expresses that same idea later. And once they build a house for God, now they begin to build houses for themselves. So kind of in a sociological sense, that makes sense.
So maybe there's a clue in there, putting up permanent walls. Would that have come before or after they had built houses in the vicinity? Because their house walls would have been stone.
I think first they built the house of the Lord, and then that sort of gave them permission to build their own houses. We can't build a house for ourselves until we build God's house.
Maybe what happened is, they did tents for the tabernacle, then they did tents for themselves. They saw the tabernacle needed walls, they put them up, then they said, okay, since now the Lord is in a house of walls, now we can make walls for ourselves. Maybe that was the progression.
I think that's exactly correct.
Very interesting. So you guys are not at the point where you've dug down where you can see the interior condition of the walls of the tabernacle, if that is it.
In some places. So we have floor level now in 3 different places, but we still have the most of the Holy of Holies, if I can use that terminology, the westernmost part of the building, are getting it down to floor level. We still have the other part, which would be the holy place, which we have a lot of work to do over there. So my estimate is I've got 4 more seasons of excavation to fully complete this building. It's really interesting because my students work with me on these projects. And so like Jordan McClinton is one of my students. He's doing his PhD on the Fabisa, the bone deposit in Area D. Tim Lopez is doing his PhD at an Israeli university, Ariel University, on this monumental building. So it's really interesting research, and it's fascinating to get to work with my students on these projects and bring them to fruition.
So would there be any point in examining the interior condition of the walls to see if were cubbies, picked into it, or were there, holes where you could fix, again, a tent material or other materials or sconces or, things or candles or what's on the inside of the walls? Any particular features?
Yes, of course, we examine those very carefully. Nothing yet stands out. It's also something we have to be careful with is because the building is large. That means it's going to be used for a long period of time, even after it's not functioning as the tabernacle. So the Philistines destroy Shiloh, for example, around 1075 BC. The site is abandoned for a few decades. And then in the Iron Age 2A, let's say around 980 BC, something like that, Israelites return and they repurpose this building. Then we get later perpendicular walls that are cut into this building. So dating the walls to particular times is critical. So if we do find niches, for example, then the next question would be, do they date to the tabernacle period or are they from the period of reuse?
Yeah, that's complicated. Right.
People like a jigsaw puzzle. I've got one for them. They should go to digshiloh.org, our website, and check it out and come help us.
Oh, okay. I mean, with everything going on, when would be your next period of activity there, or it's just on hold for now?
We did excavate this summer in the middle of the war. We were one of the few excavations that actually worked, and I had a smaller team than normal, but we did excavate, and I am going back personally in a few weeks to speak at a couple of conferences, assuming my flights are not canceled. And then I plan to be there again this May and June excavating unless, our flights are canceled or the Antiquities Authority just simply won't allow us to go.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
If we're going to wait for peace in the Middle East before we work, we're not going to get a lot done. Yeah. It's a region that has experienced conflict for millennia. My heart goes out to them, and it's just a really difficult time that everyone's going through. Of course, October the 7th is just upon us, and so our hearts go out to people suffering right now. In the midst of that, we'd like to continue to do our work and our research, and hopefully be a blessing to everyone we encounter.
Excellent. Well, very good, Scott. Thank you so much for coming on this podcast. It's been a really interesting call.
Hey, I've enjoyed talking with you. All the best.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.